In 1940, the United States Army already had an answer. If a major European war came, if American divisions crossed the Atlantic, if one general had to stand above the rest, most of the men who mattered would not have said Dwight Eisenhower. They would not have said Omar Bradley. They might not even have said George Patton. The name that kept rising through the serious rooms was Hugh Drum, General Hugh A. Drum, a senior field commander with the résumé the Army understood. 30 years in uniform, a World War I record tied to Pershing's campaigns. Senior staff work under real wartime pressure, major commands in the peacetime Army, political visibility, institutional confidence. By the old measurement, Drum did not look like a gamble. He looked like the result. And Eisenhower? Eisenhower looked like a man still waiting for the Army to notice him. In 1940, he was a lieutenant colonel. He had not commanded troops in combat. He was known mostly as a staff officer who had served under Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines. His career had talent in it, but not inevitability. 6 years later, Eisenhower would stand at the center of the Allied victory in Europe. Drum would be retired. And the strangest part is this: the Army was not confused when it expected Drum. It was using exactly the system it had built. The question is why George Marshall decided that system was giving him the wrong answer. To understand the decision, you have to start with what Hugh Drum represented. He was not some empty uniform with connections and nothing else. That would make the story too simple. Drum had served in the First World War in the kind of staff work that actually mattered. Moving armies, coordinating supply, handling plans under pressure, operating close to the machinery of command while Pershing's forces fought in France. The officers who knew that world understood what those roles required. Staff work at that level was not clerical. It was the nervous system of a modern army. After the war, Drum rose in the way a serious officer was supposed to rise. Command assignments, staff assignments, visibility, seniority, trust. By the mid-1930s, he commanded 1st Army, the largest American field army, in a smaller peacetime army that mattered. A man in that position was not merely holding a job. He was standing on the platform from which future wartime command could be expected to launch. So when Europe began to burn again in 1939, Drum's name had weight. Newspapers mentioned him. Washington circles discussed him. Supporters treated his rise as logical. In the Army's own language, his record made sense. He had the years, he had the grade, he had the senior command, he had the First World War credential. And he had advocates who believed the next war should finally give him the command his career had been preparing him to hold. But in September 1939, another man stepped into the center of the Army. George C. Marshall became Chief of Staff. And Marshall did not look at generals the same way the system looked at generals. Marshall respected records. He understood seniority. He knew the Army could not be run by impulse. But he had also spent decades watching officers perform in public, perform for superiors, perform on paper, and perform under pressure. Those were not the same thing. Marshall wanted more than a résumé that looked correct. He wanted judgment he had seen with his own eyes. He wanted officers who could handle ambiguity, not just officers who had passed through the right stations. Most important, he seemed wary of officers whose advancement was being pushed too loudly outside normal command channels. Not because ambition was a crime. Ambition was everywhere. But public campaigning for high command told Marshall something about a man, or at least something about the circle around him. It suggested that reputation was being manufactured before responsibility had been assigned, and Hugh Drum's supporters had been active for years. That did not erase Drum's record, but it changed the way Marshall read it. Marshall kept his own mental and written inventory of officers. He watched who stayed clear under pressure. He noticed who could organize chaos. He noticed who chose able subordinates rather than flattering ones. He noticed who could translate confusion into decisions. The Army had efficiency reports. Marshall had observations. And as the war drew closer, those two methods began to point in different directions. Drum's name did not disappear at once. No serious officer of his rank simply vanished from consideration. But the center of gravity shifted. Some officers who looked strong on paper became less attractive when Marshall imagined the actual war ahead. Others, lower in rank and lighter in formal command, began to rise because Marshall had seen something specific in them. One of them was Eisenhower. The first sign came during the large Louisiana maneuvers in 1941. These exercises were not a real war, but they were far larger and messier than ordinary peacetime routine. Units moved badly. Communications broke, plans collided. Commanders had to process confusion quickly and still make the machine work. Eisenhower did not stand out because he looked like a battlefield legend. He stood out because he could manage complexity. He could see the moving parts. He could communicate across levels of command. He could keep the argument focused on the practical question, what has to be done next? That mattered to Marshall. Then Pearl Harbor came. After December 1941, Eisenhower was brought to Washington. In the War Plans Division, he worked close enough to Marshall that talent could no longer hide behind rank. The problems arriving on his desk were enormous. Europe, the Pacific, shipping, Allied priorities, British pressure, American inexperience. Political demands moving through military decisions like a second weather system. Eisenhower had to read incomplete information and turn it into usable recommendations. He had to understand not only what the Army wanted, but what the British would accept, what Washington could support, and what a coalition could actually do. This was the part of command the old promotion ladder barely measured. Not bravery, not seniority, not even technical military knowledge by itself. Coalition command. The ability to keep powerful allies from pulling the war apart while still moving them toward a common objective. That was the coming test in Europe, and Marshall believed he had seen that quality in Eisenhower. In June 1942, Marshall sent Eisenhower to London to command American forces in the European theater. On paper, the choice looked almost reckless. Eisenhower had no combat command record. He had not led an army in battle. He was far junior to men whose uniforms carried more visible authority. Hugh Drum had the kind of career the Army had spent decades teaching officers to respect. Eisenhower had something less formal and more dangerous to judge. He had Marshall's confidence, and Marshall's confidence rested on a different question. Not, who has waited longest, not, who has accumulated the most visible credentials, but, who can do the specific job this war is about to demand. The European theater was never going to be a simple American command. The British had been fighting since 1939. They had their own experience, their own losses, their own generals, their own strategic fears, and their own prime minister. Churchill did not become quiet because America arrived. Alan Brooke was not going to surrender British judgment because an American wore a new title. Montgomery was not going to become easy to manage because Washington wanted unity. The American commander in Europe would need to plan campaigns, yes. But he would also need to absorb egos, national pride, political interference, strategic disagreement, and public pressure. He would need to disagree without shattering the alliance. He would need to bend without looking weak. He would need to hold together men who often believed they knew better than each other. That was not a staff problem. That was a human problem inside a military structure. Marshall thought Eisenhower could do it. Hugh Drum, meanwhile, received Eastern Defense Command. It was not a fake assignment. The Atlantic coast had to be defended. German U-boats were operating in the Atlantic. Sabotage and coastal attacks were not imaginary threats in 1942. The command required organization, seriousness, and competence. Drum gave it those things, but everybody understood what the assignment was not. It was not North Africa. It was not Sicily. It was not the cross-channel invasion. It was not the main theater where American generalship would be tested in front of the world. Drum had been expected to lead forces into Europe. Instead, he commanded the defense of a coastline the enemy never invaded. While that was happening, Eisenhower moved into the war everyone had once expected Drum to command. He oversaw the North African landings. He became Supreme Allied Commander in the Mediterranean. Then in Europe, he became the Central American figure in the coalition that would plan and execute the invasion of Normandy. Other names rose with him: Bradley, Patton. Commanders who had been junior or uncertain in 1940 now had battle records being written in real time. The war began creating its own hierarchy, and once combat began doing that, the old pre-war lists lost their power. This is where the story becomes harder than a simple celebration of Marshall's genius. Because Marshall was right about Eisenhower. That much is visible. Eisenhower held the alliance together through tensions that could have cracked it. He dealt with Churchill's pressure, British strategic priorities, Montgomery's difficult command personality, American impatience, and the enormous burden of keeping political unity attached to military action. He was not always brilliant in the dramatic sense. That may have been the point. He was steady. He could listen without being captured. He could decide without making every disagreement personal. He could let other men keep their pride while still keeping the command structure intact. Those qualities mattered so much that, in hindsight, they can look obvious. But they were not obvious in 1940. The Army's formal system had not been built to measure them. It could measure assignments, it could count years, it could read efficiency reports, it could reward seniority and visible command. But it could not stage a 4-year alliance with Britain just to see which American general could survive it. And that leaves the uncomfortable part. Was Hugh Drum truly the wrong man, or was he simply a man whose most important test never came? His record was real. His experience was real. His rise was not invented out of nothing. The fact that Marshall preferred another man does not prove Drum had no ceiling. It only proves that Marshall did not believe Drum's record answered the question Europe was about to ask. Maybe Marshall saw a limitation others missed. Maybe the public advocacy around Drum signaled exactly the wrong kind of command temperament. Maybe a career built inside the Army's peacetime ladders had not prepared him for the politics of coalition war. All of that is possible. But the opposite cannot be disproved. Maybe Drum, if given the theater, would have adapted. Maybe the qualities the Army never measured were present in him but dormant, waiting for conditions that never arrived. History did not run the experiment. It ran Eisenhower, and Eisenhower passed. Drum retired in 1943, while the war was still being fought. He left the stage before the largest decisions were made, before Normandy, before Germany's surrender, before the post-war memory of American command settled around Eisenhower's name. That retirement did not create a scandal equal to the size of the expectation that had once surrounded him. By then the war had moved on. The old argument sounded smaller. The pre-war logic had been overtaken by wartime proof. But the gap remains. In 1940, the Army system looked at its own officers and found Hugh Drum. George Marshall looked at the war he expected and found Dwight Eisenhower. The difference between those answers is the story. Because systems are built from the problems institutions already understand, they reward what they already know how to see. Seniority, assignments, credentials, standing, visible command. But a new kind of war can arrive with a new kind of test, and the quality that decides everything may be the one no evaluation form had been designed to capture. In Europe, that quality was not just the ability to command Americans. It was the ability to keep an alliance alive long enough for American power to matter. Hugh Drum had the record the Army knew how to respect. Eisenhower had the qualities Marshall believed the coming war would demand. One man was the system's answer. The other was Marshall's answer. And only one of those answers crossed the Atlantic. The Army had measured the latter. Marshall measured the war.